Borges' story, The Immortal, has a character seeking out the city of the immortals and the river of immortality and finding both, and as we see, becoming immortal himself and being horrified by the city, which turns out to have been a replacement for the original city of the immortals. And now he is one of them with them. And he's getting revealed all the backstory by Homer, who is one of the troglodytes, who is just a immortal there. And we pick up in the fourth part with some reflections on what it's like to actually be immortal. So he begins by saying there's nothing very remarkable about being immortal. With the exception of mankind, all creatures are immortal. Why? Because they know nothing of death. Now, that doesn't mean that they're immortal in the same sense, because then he goes on and says, what is divine, terrible, and incomprehensible is to know oneself as immortal. And this is why the immortals tore down their beautiful city and erected another beautiful, but again, horrifying with cosmic horror, the way that Borges describes it, city which doesn't make any sense whatsoever and contains a palace that is heterogeneous, a place to worship gods who also don't make any sense either. So then the narrator goes on and contrasts two religious points of view, saying, people claim that religion solves this problem of immortality. I'll talk about two different ways this happens. So Jews, Christians, and Muslims, those who believe in some sort of judgment, a good place and a bad place that you can go to, he says that, the conviction of one's own immortality is extraordinarily rare despite religion. Jews, Christians, and Muslims profess belief in immortality, but the veneration paid to the first century of life is proof that they truly believe only in those 100 years, for they destine all the rest throughout eternity to rewarding or punishing what one did while alive. So we're getting some interesting distinctions about what it means to be immortal. It's not the same thing as eternity. It's to be alive, right? Now, maybe this is bad theology. We don't have to worry too much about that. Then he talks about the religions of the wheel from Hindustan. So we're talking about the dharmic religions of the Indian subcontinent. And he says, well, this seems a little bit more plausible. On that wheel, which has neither end nor beginning, each life is the effect of the previous life and engenderer of the next. Yet no one life determines the whole. And then he moves on, because neither of these are actually relevant to the situation of the Republic of Immortals, as he calls them, who actually are immortal in this world, in this life. So he talks about them in a number of different ways. He says, taught by centuries of living, the immortals had attained a perfection of tolerance, almost of disdain. And he'll tell us why in a moment. But there is one other thing that I do want to come to. They have this belief of the world as a system of exact compensations, and it's going to lead to a certain mindset. We might even call it a privative or negative mindset. So, what are their thoughts about things? They knew over an infinitely long span of time, all things happen to all men. Now, do they actually have an infinite amount of time ahead of them? Well, theoretically, if the world goes on. As it turns out in the story, they actually don't, but we'll get to that in a bit. So over an infinitely long span of time, all things happen to all men who happen to be immortal. So, as a reward for his past and future virtues, every man merited every kindness, yet also every betrayal, as a reward for his past and future iniquities. Much as the way in which games of chance, heads and tails tend to even out, so cleverness and dullness cancel and correct each other. The most fleeting thought obeys an invisible plan and may crown or inaugurate a secret design. So, viewed in that way, all of our acts are just, though also unimportant. There's a kind of meaninglessness to all of our actions, should we become immortal in that sense. And he says, considered in that way, nobody has any spiritual or intellectual merits. Why? Because sooner or later you're bound to do things in one way or another. And then he's got this really interesting statement. I am God, hero, philosopher, demon, and world. Right? So each of these is something that I will be. But what this really means, he says, is this is a long-winded way of saying, I am not. There's no real me that is immortal over this infinite timeline. So what happens if you adopt this mindset? He says that the immortals became immune to pity. And he gives the example of one of them who falls down and nobody comes along to help him out. And even that immortal, fallen into the deepest of pits, who could not be hurt, could not die, and burned with thirst, 70 years passed before he was thrown a rope. He was not much interested in his own fate. His body was a submissive domestic animal. All the charity it required each month was a few hours' sleep, a little water, and a scrap of meat. And he says, none of us were ascetics, though. There's no more complex pleasure than thought, and it was to thought that we devoted ourselves over, right? That is what they spend their time on. Later, he's going to talk about perfect quietude, just doing nothing, right? Unless something comes along, some extraordinary stimulus, like the rain in this case, to bring them out of it, the ancient elemental pleasure that the rain brings. So he says, among the corollaries to the doctrine, there's nothing that's not counterbalanced than another. There's one that has little theoretical importance, but caused us to scatter over the face of the earth, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Before that, though, he says something contrasting mortal and immortal people. He says, death, or reference to death, makes men precious and pathetic. Their ghostliness is touching. Any act they perform may be their last. There's no face that's not on the verge of blurring or fading away like the faces in a dream. Everything in the world of mortals has the value of the irrecoverable and contingent. Among the immortals, on the other hand, every act, every thought is the echo of others that preceded it in the past, with no visible beginning, and the faithful presage of others that will repeat it in the future. There's nothing that is not as though lost between indefatigable mirrors. Nothing can occur but once. Nothing is preciously in peril of being lost. So, again, things become meaningless in that mindset. It's not truly a gift to become immortal. And the immortals, in one of their moments of activity, come to a reasoning that scatters them throughout the world. There is a river whose waters give immortality. Somewhere there must be another river whose waters take it away. The number of rivers is not infinite. An immortal traveler wandering the world will someday have drunk from them all. We resolve to find that river. And so he talks about his own quests. I wandered through new realms, new empires. I fought at Stamford Bridge, though I no longer recall whether I stood in the ranks of Harold or that ill-fated Harald Hardrada who conquered only 6 feet or a little more of English soil. In the 7th century of the Hejira, on the outskirts of Balak, I translated in a language I have forgotten, in an alphabet I know not, the 7 voyages of Sinbad and the story of the city of brass. In a courtyard of the prison of Samarkand, I often played chess. In Bikaner, I have taught astrology, as I have in Bohemia. He goes on and on and on. And he talks about how one day he ran across a river, and he tasted the clear water of the spring, and a thorny tree scratched the back of my hand. The unaccustomed pain seemed exceedingly sharp. Incredulous, speechless, and in joy, I contemplated the precious formation of a slow drop of blood. I am once more mortal. Again, I am like other men. That night I slept till daybreak. So he manages to remove his immortality. And then he writes this account. And, as Borges sometimes does, he has the narrator reflecting on it and others as well. The narrator says, "A year has passed and I reread these pages. I can attest they do not stray beyond the bounds of truth, but I believe I detect a certain falseness in them." Right? There's no false statements, he says, but there's something else that's going on. And he says, "The story I've told seems unreal because the experiences of two different men are intermingled in it." And he goes through and sort of, examines each of the assertions he made about when he was traveling around. And he says, "None of these statements are false. What is significant is the fact of them having been chosen to record. I chose them. The first seems to befit a man of war. One sees the narrator pays little attention to the war, much more to the fate of the men. The facts that follow are even more curious. A dark yet elemental reason led me to put them to paper. I knew they were pathetic. They are not pathetic when narrated by the Roman Flaminius Rufus. They are when narrated by Homer." So perhaps he is himself Homer. And he says, "I may have confused those who once portrayed me with those who were symbols of the fate of the person that accompanied me for so many centuries. I have been Homer. Soon, like Ulysses, I shall be nobody. I shall be all men. I shall be dead." Right? And then there's some reflections on everything breaking down into words. But I think that is a fitting place to end this story about a person who learns what the boon of immortality actually would bring to human beings, according to Borges.